Hi, I'm George Abraham, and I'm here to speak to you on the theme of a voice for the voiceless. I must acknowledge Nick Nurani here in the audience because he led me on this journey that I'm on in terms of lending a voice to segments of our population that don't normally get a voice in our discourse. And I didn't really coordinate my presentation with Mike, but I want to use some of what he said in terms of a third space. I want to make the argument that given our rate of immigration and the way our country is changing, we need a different discourse. We need a different conversation. And kudos to Shelley in terms of organizing an event like this, which she takes across the country to foster that kind of a discourse. And I have attended several Walrus talks, and I must say that this is the most diverse audience that I have seen anywhere. So I think bringing it to a city like Surrey is important. And I think cities like Surrey are the Canada of tomorrow. And I want to suggest that what we do at New Canadian Media is emblematic of the change that is happening in Canada right before our eyes. So what I found when I arrived in Canada in 2002 was two media extremes. One is the mainstream, another was the ethnic, and there was no conversation between them. So one was very narrowly cast and the other was too whitewashed. It was trying to not truly relate to the segment of the population that was coming from elsewhere. And we see that, of course, in Surrey, where 41% of the city is foreign-born. 14% have arrived just in the last 10 years. And, of course, a very strong representation of people from India and the Philippines. So what I found was there was no coherent national voice to articulate the sentiment and the aspirations and the perspectives of people who were new to this Canada. And I also thought that there must be some commonalities between the life experiences that we bring as immigrants to Canada. It doesn't matter where you come from, but you share a set of lived experiences. And that's why I launched New Canadian Media about 4 years ago. And I called it immigrant journalism, a journalism that is informed by our lived experience elsewhere and moving from one country to another, but also enables us to relate to immigrants in a better way, to in fact put ourselves in somebody else's shoes and try and experience what Queenie talked about in terms of refugees. If you've lived elsewhere, you've seen poverty, you've experienced corruption, you've stood at a border trying to get in, you know what it means to be in those shoes. And I think as an immigrant, and as we have immigrants across the country writing for us, I think we bring a certain empathy to that scenario. So the premise of New Canadian Media is that this country is changing rapidly, but our media does not reflect the entire reality of the country. And so it's rooted in the idea that there are certain common denominators of immigration that unite all of those who begin life in a new land. It's a different worldview, a perspective that is born out of a lived experience of immigration and their time in another country, most often in another part of the world. This is particularly relevant to communities that are often misrepresented in the media. And of course, a lot has been written about doctors, engineers who have not been able to find their foothold in Canada. I asked myself, and I still remember a conversation with Shelley I had, I think, 3-4 years ago. I said, there must be a lot of immigrant journalists who come to this country and have never, ever written in Canada. And I said, let's try and tap into a network like that. And I must say that some of my most exciting moments in this venture have been talking to participants in our workshops or people who've gone through a mentorship program and said, you just helped me get over depression. Because imagine the mindset of an immigrant journalist who comes to this country and wants to participate in the media landscape of Canada and is not able to. So I've been really fortunate to be able to, I think, network with about 200 people across the country to articulate a different perspective. Obviously, it goes without saying that our newsrooms do not represent the rest of the country. Our newsroom demographics are, first, they are dated. There are no studies that accurately reflect the demographics of today, but I think it's safe to say that they do not represent the population that they serve. And what we've been trying to do is to try and bring that different perspective, not only in terms of representing the immigrant point of view, but also offering content for mainstream organizations so that they are more inclusive in the journalism that we do. Very much like, again, what Mike was talking about in terms of inclusive design, trying to look at what we have and trying to do things differently. So in a nutshell, you can come to this country, you can bring credentials, but you find it very hard to get into a newsroom simply because you don't have the experience of having lived in Canada. For example, one of the most common questions you are asked is, have you ever chased a fire truck? You know, it's one of the basics of reporting in Canada, and most often we have not. So there obviously is a lack of representative journalism here in Canada. Like everywhere else, journalists are very good at holding people to account, but we don't spend a lot of time trying to look within our newsrooms and seeing whether or not we are reflecting the Canada that is right before our eyes. Hence, I find that there is a huge disconnect, and I sense that there will probably come a moment when Canada will face its own Brexit moment, when suddenly we will find that we are faced with a reality that we never contemplated ourselves. And I think part of trying to address a scenario like that would be to make sure that our journalism is always inclusive, that it tries to represent every possible perspective that there is. That's why I think New Canadian Media and our effort to portray an immigrant voice in all its color and diversity is so important. It taps into a rich vein of journalism that serves two immediate needs. It reflects the new and emerging Canada with 1 in 5 Canadians born abroad and an equal number of first-generation Canadians. Secondly, we have tried to marshal immigrant journalists to a nonprofit endeavor. There are literally hundreds of them across Canada who've come with high hopes but ended up in dead-end jobs. I know, speaking to many of them, that it's an extremely depressing situation to be in. I've heard this sentiment so often that it rings true. You saved me from depression. Although I know there were lots of journalists who had arrived in Canada, but I'd never worked in a Canadian newsroom, it had not occurred to me how devastating that might be. Now I get it, and I totally get it. Most of them, like me, came from Asia or Africa, where journalism is not for the faint-hearted. It's something that you choose to do, and it's often under extremely oppressive conditions. So we like to be game changers. We like to go against the grain. We take on dictators. We fight for the landless. We defy crime mafias, and hence we bring the same passion to Canada. So in summary, I'd like to say that I think we've been fairly successful in trying to articulate a different perspective in Canadian discourse. We have networked with about 200 writers and journalists across Canada. We are, in fact, trying to launch a series very similar to what Walrus Talks is doing in the immigrant space. We are trying to launch a collective of immigrant journalists in Canada, and I think we want to follow in the Walrus footsteps in terms of enlarging the Canadian conversation. Thank you.